On this Friday night, a Canadian who left this country to fight for ISIS in Syria appears to make a shocking admission, telling a popular podcast that while there, he carried out an execution-style killing. Today, we tracked him down in Toronto, confronted him about it, and heard a very different story. Also tonight, merging man and machine, how workers on this auto assembly line are getting a bionic upgrade. All that and more coming your way. This is The National. New and stunning details have emerged about a Canadian who went to Syria to join ISIS in its bloodthirsty version of jihad. He's also a young man who's back here, living in Canada, and who has spoken to us before.
There was also beheadings too.
His nickname with ISIS was Abu Huzaifa al-Kanadi. Last September, on a promise to keep his identity confidential, he revealed to us how he traveled to Syria and joined the ISIS morality police. Back then, he said he witnessed horrific acts, but never killed anyone himself.
Canadians shouldn't see me as a threat because of the reason I grew up with them, and Canada has a huge role in what I am now too.
But now we're hearing a different story. On the New York Times podcast, Caliphate, Abu Huzaifa said this.
This guy was a drug dealer. I had to stab him in the heart. The blood was it was warm. And it sprayed everywhere. And the guy was crying and screaming.
Huzaifa described taking part in a kind of execution of men who resisted ISIS. Now, we have John Lancaster joining us right now because, John, you originally spoke with Abu Huzaifa for CBC, and you tracked him down in Toronto today to confront him about this apparent confession. So when you did that, what happened? How did he react?
Well, we put it to him several times directly, Andrew. How could you say these things if you didn't actually do them? He says he doesn't deny saying them, but he's insistent that he didn't actually do those things. He says he was interviewed for this podcast quite a while ago, back in 2016, 2 or 3 weeks after he'd returned from Pakistan after fleeing Syria and fleeing ISIS. He said at the time he was suffering from PTSD, having flashbacks from the horrors he witnessed, and using hard drugs to essentially try to self-medicate to get these demons out of his mind. When I pressed him, though, again, I said, these are very graphic details you've described. How is it that you could describe in such detail, yet you didn't do it? He told me I was describing what I saw. He said, basically, I was close enough, Andrew, to think it was actually me.
Okay, and so what is the situation now exactly? I mean, he's in Toronto?
Yeah, we walked into this suburban Toronto restaurant, and he looked over his shoulder, saw us. At first he smiled, then realized why we were probably there. This isn't someone who looks like an ISIS soldier. He's a 23-year-old man studying at university, clean-cut, well-spoken, very soft-spoken, and in fact, at one point actually broke down in tears today when discussing this. It's clear he's hoping to move on to his life, but it's not clear if that's going to happen, especially after these latest revelations.
Right. So, John, I mean, he gave you an explanation, but given what he has apparently confessed to, has he been approached by police?
He's been interviewed several times, he said, by police. Shortly after we interviewed that interview in 2017, he said he was contacted by the RCMP, who figured out who he was and where he was. But he says since then, nothing. Today, though, after these podcasts surfaced and were aired and raised in the House of Commons, he said he got a call from CSIS, and they plan to pay him a visit next week, Andrew.
Okay. John Lancaster reporting tonight. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Now, at this point, you may be asking, why aren't we revealing who this man is, given the severe nature of what we just heard? Well, let's start from the beginning. Abu Huzaifa trusted the CBC to protect his identity. That's something we take extremely seriously. But trust is a two-way street. And the New York Times podcast clearly contradicts what he told us on some pretty critical details. So we are now trying to nail down the truth and may revisit our arrangement with him. Meanwhile, as you heard, his identity is known to law enforcement, and so far he has not been charged with a crime. As the story evolves, we will keep you updated. But that hard facts on Huzaifa may be hard to come by didn't seem to stop the fallout from spreading in Ottawa. Evan Dyer takes us there.
This brought some pointed questions for the government today in the House of Commons, with Conservatives asking, how can a man who brags about committing war crimes for ISIS be walking free in suburban Ontario?
This individual described how he executed individuals by shooting them in the back of the head. He said that the people he was shooting deserved it, and he said, I know I won't be held accountable. He said that at least twice.
What I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that CSIS, the RCMP, and all the related security and police agencies of this country are doing their job and taking all of the steps necessary to ensure that justice is enforced.
That's not good enough. This guy is apparently in Toronto. Canadians deserve more answers from this government.
Absolutely.
Why aren't they doing something about this despicable animal?
One former CSIS analyst says returnees like Abu Huzaifa are an example to other would-be jihadis.
The guys that return are heroes. They've been there, done that, got the T-shirt. They've amazing exploits on behalf of a terrorist group, and they act as inspiration for others. So if nothing happens to this individual, and he deserves his day in court, don't get me wrong. This should be a fair and transparent process. But if nothing happens to him, the message is it's okay to join a terrorist group, which is an offense. It's okay to travel abroad, which is an offense. It's okay to kill somebody, which is an offense. And nothing's going to happen to you.
It's important to note that whether Abu Huzaifa committed this murder or not, he's also confessed to several other crimes. Just traveling to Syria to join ISIS is a crime that carries a potential 10-year sentence, although to date, no one's been convicted of that. Evan Dyer, CBC News, Ottawa.
And on that note, there is another question here. If we look at the big picture, how many others like Abu Huzaifa might be out there? Well, according to a 2017 government report, there were about 190 so-called extremist travelers with links to Canada suspected of engaging in terrorist activity abroad. And the government is aware of about 60 that have returned to Canada. Now, Syria is also in the middle of escalating hostility between Israel and Iran. Today, both the U.S. President and British Prime Minister called Iran's attacks on Israel destabilizing, but avoided criticizing Israel's counterattacks on Iranian positions in Syria, which, by the way, is still in a brutal civil war of its own. Margaret Evans went to one village torn apart by the fighting.
Hollowed-out streets on the way to Yalda, a town wedged in with a handful of others on the outskirts of Damascus. This is day one of what Bashar al-Assad supporters call the village's liberation, and we've been invited to a flag raising. Earlier this week, after a major government offensive, some 10,000 rebel fighters took up the offer of passage out of Yalda, boarding buses to a rebel-held area in the north. Local officials, eager to mark the moment, have a few false starts before finding their way up to the rooftop of the municipal building.
It is a small scene, but it's one that the Syrian government very much wanted us to see. They want to deliver the message to us, and so to the outside world, that they're winning this war.
Mir Mohammed Hamid says it's been 5 years since he's set foot in his office. I ask him about reconciliation between pro and anti-regime fighters.
لا.
Why not?
ليش؟ لأنه انذبحوا الشعب العربي السوري بعضه.
Because they killed and slaughtered each other.
The fighting isn't over yet, but the outside world is preoccupied with the tensions between Israel and Iran. Israel accusing Iran of using Syria as a launch pad against the Jewish state. Today, the Israeli Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman warned the Syrian president about the company he's keeping. I have a message for Assad, he's saying. Get rid of the Iranians. They're not helping you. It's prompted an angry reaction here in Damascus.
We have the freedom to choose our allies, our friends, and look for our friends, and look forward to recapture and find, to get our land again.
Israel captured the Golan Heights from Syria in 1967, later annexing it in a move still not recognized by the international community. In Yalda, people have more immediate concerns, finding their way back to homes lost and lives put on hold, if that's possible. Nothing is normal anymore. The thud of airstrikes goes unnoticed, kids play with an old lathe locals say the rebels left behind, used to make mortars. Margaret Evans, CBC News, Yalda.
Here's a quick look at what's ahead on The National. A CBC News investigation raises serious questions about the way one company is selling its cannabis extract. Also, residents of Lac-Mégantic are happy that train tracks will never return to their town, but is rerouting the tracks just rerouting the problem? But first, 3 people from Canada are speaking out after one day leaving an Airbnb and then being confronted by police. Now, how such a seemingly trivial act led to such a serious encounter has a lot of people in the U.S. talking about racial injustice. That's because the neighbors who called the cops were white, and those Airbnb renters, they were not. The CBC's Stephen D'Souza spoke with them today.
I thought that we were going to be shot. That was my first reaction.
It's been almost 2 weeks, but the incident involving Kelly Fife Marshall is still fresh in her mind. She was part of a group of friends, 3 black and 1 white. They were leaving an Airbnb in Rialto, California, when a neighbor, thinking they were burglars, called police.
There's like 3 black people stealing stuff.
Stealing stuff?
Yeah, like breaking into the house and taking things.
No, we're taking our suitcases out of the house.
Right.
Their video of the incident went viral, in part because one woman in the group is the granddaughter of music legend Bob Marley.
When the officer jumped out of the car and started to point, hands up! Hands up! And everybody's hands started to go up.
You're talking to Bob Marley's granddaughter? Awesome.
She says that fact helped make sure the situation ended peacefully. But she says not everyone in America is so lucky. So they're speaking out about what happened and threatening the Rialto police with legal action.
We're very conscious that in these moments we have a platform and we are brave enough to use it to be a voice on behalf of those who did not live to tell their story.
But what Denisha Prendergast and her friends describe as traumatic, Rialto city officials say was well handled, releasing body cam video showing what they describe as a jovial encounter.
Our officers that were involved in this situation handled the call for service with dignity, respect, and the utmost professionalism.
Fife Marshall says her good nature in the police video was her way of coping with the indignity of being pulled over.
And it's one of the instances I'm going to laugh or I'm going to cry, and so I laughed.
They say their message is a serious one, that racial profiling must stop, and those who call police on black people in these situations need to be held accountable.
It's unfair for one person to have that amount of power over somebody else's life and destiny.
Prendergast says everyone needs to speak up.
Everybody loves my grandfather's music, but when it comes down to the actual fight and to the actual call to action that it sends to you, people don't want to stand up.
They say being surrounded by police just for doing everyday things should not be the price of being black in America. Stephen D'Souza, CBC News, New York.
Now, racial profiling has been in the news a lot lately.
I'm not taking your picture. This is Facebook Live.
Here's what we're going to do. That's fine. Now, Steve mentioned an incident at Yale. On Tuesday, that's where a white person called campus police after she found a black woman asleep in a common area. She was a grad student there, but officers demanded to see her ID even after she unlocked her own dorm room to prove she wasn't someone who had just broken in. Video also surfaced this week of an officer pretty aggressively arresting a black man in North Carolina. According to witnesses, it started with an argument between that black man and a restaurant employee. Then came police and the takedown. The suspect was dressed up because he'd just been at a school prom.
Yeah, actually, we're just going to check your pockets real quick.
Almost 2 weeks ago, at a Colorado university, police questioned and searched 2 indigenous teenagers. Another parent had called the officers, complaining the 2 brothers were creepy and stood out. But they were just there for a tour. They were considering enrolling. In Alabama, about a week earlier, police were recorded throwing a black woman to the floor of a Waffle House restaurant. They grabbed her throat, threatened to break her arm, and in the scuffle, exposed her breast. In that case, police defended their action, saying their officers were in the right and that the woman had been drunk and disorderly.
There are 2 black guys sitting here meeting me?
And all of this comes after last month's Starbucks incident in Philadelphia, when police arrested 2 black men who'd been sitting at a table without making a purchase. They'd asked to use the bathroom, but were told it was for paying customers only. They were eventually released without charge. And today, Starbucks announced that all of its bathrooms will now be made available to anyone, whether or not they've bought anything. Well, in the world of alternative medicine, something called cannabidiol oil seems to be the elixir of the moment. It's a cannabis extract being touted as a miracle treatment for everything from anxiety to cancer.
CBD has anti-proliferative effects, which means it can stop tumor cells from spreading.
So this is a video uploaded last week on Facebook by a group called Herb. And in that short time, it's racked up more than 3.5 million views, which is quite a bit. But the real health benefits of so-called CBD oil are still very much an open question. And as Katie Nicholson tells us, the lack of science hasn't stopped many from buying in.
Sun-kissed on an organic Kentucky farm, carefully extracted in a lab. Hempworks cannabidiol oil makes big promises.
It's the highest quality, most pure, most natural, and most effective CBD that's on the planet.
The problem is, that's not the only thing Hempworks has to say about its product. The fine print may say it isn't intended to treat, cure, or prevent disease, but that's on a document making serving suggestions. Daily amounts to take for conditions such as epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, schizophrenia, and glaucoma. And that's at odds with Canada's tough stance on how pot products can be marketed. Health Canada is especially concerned about advertisements of any kind which are false, misleading, or deceptive, and those which advertise cannabis in relation to particular therapeutic claims. Hempworks did not respond to our repeated requests for comment.
In a nutshell, we're not allowed to make health claims on our packaging or on any advertising.
Canopy Growth is Canada's largest legal pot producer. It says in an industry trying to cultivate trust, it's important to stick to the facts.
Any of the health claims that are being made are just outside of the rules that we're all playing by.
This Hempworks training webinar instructs salespeople to avoid words like cures, prevents, diagnose, and treats.
Now, what you can say to build excitement and say it in the same way is research suggests, studies show, different users of these products are claiming.
Kind of weird. As soon as I
We showed that to professional medical skeptic Dr. Jen Gunter.
So it sounds the same, and that's what's really concerning, right? So to somebody who doesn't have a medical background, that does sound exactly like, oh, there's good studies, but it's completely different. It's really, glossing over the edges, and it's a little bit of almost like a shell game.
However they phrase it, are cannabidiol producers blowing smoke with their health claims?
We also seem to have preliminary evidence, and I want to stress that word preliminary, that cannabidiol might be useful.
Robert LaPrairie researches cannabidiol and says those preliminary studies suggest it could help a number of conditions, including epilepsy. It's just too soon to say for sure.
As a scientist, I would say that the jury is still very much out on what we have good evidence-based medicine for.
And we have Katie Nicholson joining us now. So Katie, what about this whole equation changes when pot becomes legal in this country?
You'll be able to buy CBD oil alongside your recreational pot products, but those medical claims, they still will not be able to be made about the products until the evidence supports those claims.
And claims aside, how are Canadians even getting this stuff from Hempworks if cannabis products aren't legal yet?
Well, technically, you should only be getting it with prescription, but it's kind of the wild, wild west right now. Hempworks, for example, the company we looked at, its representatives in Canada were telling people it was 100% legal. But when we spoke with Health Canada, they said, no, it's not approved for sale in Canada, and it's actually illegal to ship it across the border. Law enforcement should even get involved if they're aware of the sales. So what we did is that we did reach out to Hempworks. They didn't really get back to us, but this morning they sent out a note to their affiliates saying they were going to suspend the importation of their product in Canada until they get a permit, something they say they applied for 9 months ago.
Okay. Katie Nicholson, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And here's what else we're working on tonight on The National. What do NAFTA and the romance novel industry have in common? They've both been disrupted by U.S. President Donald Trump, of course. We'll explain. Plus, the Winnipeg Jets are heading to the Western Conference Final. You'll meet some Jets fans who have been waiting for this moment. And cyborgs on the assembly line. I try out a mechanical solution to help automotive workers in this episode of The Fix. It's kind of like I'm just resting my arms on a ledge without having to hold them up. So I feel like I could do this for a pretty long time.
It started with a summer fling with a police officer. They exchanged intimate images. When the relationship ended, Rock assumed he destroyed them. But 2 years later, as she applied for a job with Brandon Police, a nightmare scenario.
I was informed that intimate images had been brought in to the Brandon Police Service.
What went through your head when you heard that?
Shock, embarrassment, humiliation, confusion as to, how did this happen?
So how did it happen? In a civil suit, Rock alleges another woman who used to be an employee of the Brandon Police and who also had a relationship with that officer found and shared those images with Brandon Police in a case of intentional and malicious misconduct, commonly referred to as revenge porn. Sending intimate images is common among adults, and a 2015 survey at Drexel University found 88% of adults have sexted at least once in their lifetime. Is it legal to send someone intimate images of yourself?
It's perfectly legal for someone to send an image of themselves to another person as long as no one else is in the picture, unless that person has given their consent.
What if it's unsolicited?
Interesting question. I would say if the image is unsolicited and there's no sexual relationship between the parties, then you could be getting into harassment.
So is it illegal for me to send an image that I have been sent to somebody else?
An intimate image, yes, unless you know that there's consent to distributing that image.
But what if I just show you, like on my screen like this? Does that count?
What the criminal code provides is that it's an offense to make available an image to someone else. So it depends on how you define make available. In my view, showing me an image on your phone is making that image available to me and therefore a criminal offense.
Been here for 57 years and never seen this.
Tonight on The National, the worst flooding to hit southern BC in decades. Entire neighborhoods are underwater and nearly 3,000 people are under evacuation orders after days of heavy rain and melting snow.
This one all right?
Here's the scene today in Grand Forks, a community near the U.S. border, about 200 kilometers southeast of Kelowna. Waters there rose so fast last night that some people became trapped in their homes. So crews were busy today tracking down those people needing rescue as others raced to try to stop floodwaters from spreading. Tough but necessary work as a new threat settles in. Unseasonably hot temperatures in the forecast for the region over the next several days. It's expected to melt snow and make the flooding situation even worse.
We've got warm weather coming, we've got more snow, so this is with us for a while.
And with that threat looming, officials are issuing a familiar warning. Put safety first and be ready to leave home if necessary. Now, it was a big day for residents of Lac-Mégantic in Quebec today. Train tracks that once ran through their community will no more.
Today, we are taking an important step to help heal the wounds of a community that has been through so much. Canada and the government of Quebec have reached an agreement in principle to jointly fund the rail bypass project.
Lac-Mégantic's downtown core was destroyed on July 6, 2013, when a runaway train carrying crude oil jumped the tracks and exploded. 47 people were killed. And nearly 5 years later, residents are happy to see the tracks rerouted elsewhere, away from their town. But that may just create new problems elsewhere. And as Jayla Bernstein tells us, pleasing everyone may not be possible.
Diane Roy and her husband have lived in Lac-Mégantic their entire lives. Trains roll by their house up to 4 times a day.
My father worked with the train, my grandfather, and we were used to that, but now it's not the same feeling anymore. I'm frightened.
She and many in town are relieved the rail bypass will be built within 4 years.
Just knowing that now people will come back to live in town, life is coming back. So Everything will come at a day at a time.
But the promise of a rail bypass for 2022 has left the community divided. The new tracks will cut through land owned by 44 people, and in a place still grappling with a trauma that feels all too recent, emotions run high. The federal government vows it will offer fair compensation, but that's cold comfort for some.
Comment tu peux évaluer un cœur brisé? Comment que ça coûte, ça?
Sandra Jacques and her husband built their home here. Her parents live just down the hill, but the new tracks will slice right between their houses, cutting them off.
Mes enfants étaient tellement heureux de s'en venir ici parce que c'est la paix, c'est la tranquillité. Et là, c'est comme tout ça est brisé, là.
Jacques understands the need for a rail bypass, but she wishes she didn't have to sacrifice her own tranquility. It's a balancing act, says the Premier.
Certain changes could be made at the margins. Let's be clear. We won't start it from scratch.
Hua and her husband were ready to move if the bypass was refused. Now they're relieved they can spend their retirement listening to the birds and not the trains. Jayla Bernstein, CBC News, Lac-Mégantic.
Well, turning now to Toronto, where students at several high schools walked out of class in protest today. They say new rules meant to protect them from predatory teachers aren't tough enough. Our Ron Charles asked the organizers what they hope to see.
You could call this Me Too meets the burgeoning student-led protest movement, a high school walkout to demand stricter punishment for sexual misconduct by teachers. Under new legislation enacted on Wednesday, Ontario teachers found guilty of groping or sexually touching students automatically lose their teaching licenses. But these students say those new rules don't go far enough.
Everybody knows a young person.
Student Sarah Escalon-Sotomayor wants them to apply to teachers engaging in other sexually inappropriate behavior.
Sexual misconduct shouldn't be allowed in schools. And the legislation isn't clear about whether teachers found guilty of sexual misconduct will have their licenses revoked.
She gives the example of a teacher currently on home assignment pending an investigation after years of complaints about sexually inappropriate comments.
This caused an outrage at my school, especially when it came out that these allegations against him weren't adequately investigated for 5 years.
But employment lawyer David Whitten says the new rules may already be too broad.
I think the new legislation and proposed amendments are problematic because it just is so expansive now that it could capture inadvertent contact between a teacher and a student.
The protesters also want training for students, teachers, and administrators about how to recognize and deal with sexual abuse and misconduct. In just a month, they have collected 17,000 signatures on a petition.
It's really great that we have so much support. Students are passionate. They're tired of not having their voices heard.
They're hoping their voices are heard during the current Ontario election campaign and not forgotten when both the legislature and school returns in September. Ron Charles, CBC News, Toronto.
So how often do teachers lose their licenses over any kind of misconduct in this country? Well, CBC News Marketplace investigation found that 374 teachers had their certificates pulled between 2005 and 2015, the overwhelming majority in Ontario. Excluding Quebec, Canada revokes only about 1 in 5,800 teaching licenses every year. Down south in the States, that rate is about 30% higher. And next on The National, a sci-fi solution to the ravages of life on an assembly line.
I think when I retire in 6 years, I'm not going to be all hands aren't going to be all gripped up, shoulders all hurt. I've seen a lot of guys, it's after they've retired, they fell apart because 30, 40 years of doing this every day.
The Hudson's Bay Company founded Edmonton and just about every other city in the West in its quest for fur. But the centuries-old relationship with fur is ending. These are some of the last the Bay will sell. Not because of anti-fur protests, the company says, but because no one is buying.
Whether it's fashion-driven or otherwise, it's certainly not the business it used to be a decade ago.
But the powerful anti-fur lobby is claiming victory over the Bay's decision. Proof, it says, that a campaign to change Canadians' opinions about fur has worked.
Oh, well, we already knew it was going to work because of the way Europe has gone and the United States as well. It was just a matter of time because Canadians are more conservative.
The Hudson's Bay Company was created to buy beaver pelts from Canada's natives and ship them to market in Europe. The relationship endured into this century, with natives trading their pelts for food and dry goods at remote Hudson's Bay outlets. Author Peter C. Newman has written about the Bay's place in Canada's history.
It's the oldest company in the world, incidentally. And for them to withdraw from the last vestige of their genesis of the beginning, I find a little sad, because they're now just another department store.
It's also a loss for more than 100,000 Canadians like Bill Abercrombie, who still make a living from the fur trade.
Good catch, though. Never would have known what hit him.
The Hudson's Bay Company was Canada's largest fur retailer, and Abercrombie says an important symbol of the trade.
Yeah, sure it hurts. That makes it hard for a trapper to remain optimistic, to see 300 years of tradition go down the drain.
Others may disagree, but after 3 centuries, one of the original Canadian partnerships is coming to an end. Kevin Newman, CBC News, Edmonton.
The sewing machines are still humming. Fur coats are still being cut here in downtown Toronto, but news that Hudson's Bay is getting out of the fur business didn't warm any hearts on Spadina Avenue today.
The people in the fur industry are probably somewhat disappointed with the Bay's decision.
Fur prices have dropped by as much as 45% in the last 4 years alone. Furriers say it's a glut of pelts on the world market. They say it's the recession, and they say it's just a matter of time before the fur market picks up again.
As soon as the economy starts to turn around, the fur industry will prosper again, and the Hudson's Bay will lose out on that growth that we will all experience in the fur industry.
Furriers are trying to downplay the impact the anti-fur lobby is having on their business. The Canadian Fur Trade Association says 1 out of 4 Canadian women owns a fur jacket or a fur coat, and they say that's a higher proportion than ever before. But behind the tidy statistics and the lush fur pelts, there's been a grisly fight between the fur traders and the animal rights activists.
Say no to cruelty! Don't buy fur! Say no to cruelty! Don't buy fur!
Strident street protests and aggressive ad campaigns. The anti-fur lobby shocked viewers around the world with television ads like this one. Or poster ads like these that try to shame people out of wearing furs. The furriers have fought back with billboard and magazine ads like this one. Furriers like Harry Papadopoulos say animal rights activists have intimidated some fur wearers.
I think it's gotten our customers saying, geez, you know, are these people going to come up to me? But it's also gotten a few of our customers to say, well, if they do come up to me, I'll take a good shot at them with my bag. And I'm sure a few of them have had a bag in the head.
Animal rights activists say the battle is far from over, but they're claiming this as a victory for their side.
Consumers don't want to buy fur, and I think that consumers don't want to buy fur because they know now what's involved in the production of a fur coat, and they're saying, no, we are not going to buy these products of pain.
Regina Hickel-Sabo, CBC News, Toronto.
Welcome back. The Ford Motor Company is wrapped up in a bit of a science experiment at the moment, but its test subjects are not the cars themselves. They're focusing on the people who build them. Now, you might think these days it's mostly robots doing the work, but assembling all those millions of cars a year is still quite people-intensive. So Ford is looking at ways to improve human beings, mechanize them in a way, giving them superhuman qualities. And the company says this fix could make life better for everyone. So I went to an assembly plant in Wayne, Michigan, just outside Detroit, to meet a guy that Ford has been artificially augmenting through a process that's about as simple as putting on a backpack. The modern-day assembly line, millions of moving parts, and a real marriage of man and machine. More than 1,000 humans work the line here, and they are everything machines are not. Intelligent, adaptable, but also fundamentally flawed.
Oh, you're exhausted at the end of the day. My wife would say, hey, honey, let's go do something on a Wednesday night, and she'd see me walk in the door and knew I was going to tell her no, I was just too tired to do anything. My name is Paul Collins. I started working here at Ford Motor Company in 1995 in January.
24 years. Paul's learned a lot about assembling cars in that time, and the lesson that stands out, it's painful work.
I was going home at night, flopping down on the couch. I was icy hot in my neck every single night. And that's hard to explain pain, but it's just, you're tired, you're exhausted, you're fatigued.
So we're all on the same page. Paul does very little heavy lifting. It's actually kind of the opposite. A small tweak here, a little twist there. But consider this, every 50 seconds, another car goes by. You get in, you do your thing, you get out. Now do that for hundreds of cars, 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, for years. There is a body-breaking rhythm to this job.
We're programmed to do the same thing every day, all day, same process, nothing changes. And I thought to myself, do I want to do that?
If you take a look at the body parts that are being injured the most, if we look through the injury data we've got, it's low back and shoulder.
This is Marty Smets, a car guy, ergonomics expert, and number cruncher.
And the problem with the shoulder is that once it's injured, it takes a long time to return to full functionality. And it's very costly. Depending on the length of time you're off work, it can be between $30,000 and $100,000 to repair a shoulder injury.
$100,000 just for everyday wear and tear. But that's just the fact of being human, right? Maybe not.
Augmenting the human provides the best of both worlds.
Which brings us back to Paul. He's among the very first to pilot a relatively new way of merging man and machine on the job. He's wearing an upper body exoskeleton, a bionic vest.
They said you might feel better at the end of the day, and anything that's going to make me feel better at the end of the day, I'll give it a try.
To get a closer look at the vest in action, we're allowed right onto the moving assembly line. The only rules, watch your head and try not to scratch the paint. Before you had the vest, how would it feel doing this over and over again?
Well, you're holding up your arms, you're doing this all day long.
How heavy is this tool that you're holding?
3 pounds, maybe.
2 pounds?
About 3 pounds, yeah.
I bet after a full day holding that above your head, you definitely start feeling it, huh?
Yeah, you want to...
Oh yeah, that's heavy.
Slowly begins giving you lift assistance, so as it's almost as if someone's lifting your elbow up from below.
Can you show me the vest, how
I would
it
love
works?
to. Yeah, I'd love to, Andrew.
All right,
let's go do it.
Let's just put it on like a backpack. The genius of the design is how uncomplicated it is. There's no fuel, no battery, no electricity at all, just springs.
So let me turn it on for you.
Okay.
Okay, so if you just put your arms straight
down. It's what they call a passive device, completely unpowered, but it gives enough lift to make your arms and any tools you're holding feel weightless. Oh wow, it just sort of lifts your arm up.
It supports away your arm.
To be clear, infinite strength this is not, but infinite endurance? Getting there. So this is actually kind of interesting. So the way I have my arms right now, I can feel the most activation. So it's kind of like I'm just resting my arms on a ledge without having to hold them up. So I feel like I could do this for a pretty long time. This vest is just one small slice of an ever-expanding world of collaborative machines. Take the RoboGlove, for example, developed by GM and NASA. It takes a person's grip strength and amplifies it. Overseas, Audi and BMW have tested a so-called chairless chair. You can see why that might come in handy. And at Cornell University, a wearable robotic arm. Because who wouldn't want a third arm? And yet it was obvious from the start that not everybody here would be keen to let Ford artificially augment their abilities. So the union, too, was brought on board from the get-go.
So we got strict guidelines on how this will be used. We don't want the worker being told, hey, you can work a little faster, or you can lift more parts or more weight.
So you have that in writing?
We have that in writing.
It's strictly a device that you can wear as an operator if you want, or you don't have to if you don't want to wear it.
And that is why some outsiders looking in don't see this as making machines of men, at least not yet. Labor professor Merrick Masters has followed these trends for years.
One can always look at it from a 1984 perspective. or a brave new world perspective. But I look at it from a more positive point of view, that this is taking advantage of technology and trying to use it for a good purpose, to make the quality of work life and reduce injuries better. And wouldn't we be foolhardy not to take advantage of that opportunity?
I think when I retire in 6 years, I'm not going to be all hands aren't going to be all crimped up, shoulders all hurt. I've seen a lot of guys, it's after they've retired, they fell apart because 30, 40 years of doing this every day.
Back on the chassis line, Paul sees this fix quite simply. It works, so why worry? He thinks his life would have been much different if he had something like this 24 years ago, but no point looking back now. Only forward.
My grandson Jaden, he's 10 years old. And he's into flag football, he's into wrestling. So when my grandkids are home and they're over at my house, and I come in, they're grandpa, they're running, they jump on me because grandpa's supposed to be able to do that. I have a lot more energy to play with them, I wrestle with them, we roll around on the floor. I can do that now.
So there you have it. You might be wondering how much each vest actually costs. Well, according to Exobionics, that's the manufacturer, they cost between $4,000 and $7,000 US, depending on how they're customized. So individually, a company like Ford can certainly afford the vests, but keep in mind, they've got tens of thousands of assembly line workers right around the world. And if you do the math, outfitting each worker, that's hundreds of millions of dollars just for the vests, never mind extra costs like training and maintenance. But still, you gotta start somewhere, I suppose. And still ahead on tonight's National. Harlequin romance novels. Yes, they're still a thing, and yes, they still use guys like that to advertise on TV. But in the age of Donald Trump, the romance novel is getting a rewrite.
This year 2000 election is not the first U.S. presidential vote with a razor-thin margin that has come along to test the U.S. Constitution. Consider the election of Thomas Jefferson exactly 200 years ago. After the hard-fought election of 1800, the Virginian Jefferson was tied in the Electoral College vote with Aaron Burr of New York. It was a constitutional crisis. As could well happen again this year, the matter was sent off to the Congress for resolution. There were 36 ballots in the House of Representatives until Jefferson was finally declared the winner by one vote. The loser, Aaron Burr, was bitter and blamed his defeat on the scheming against him by Alexander Hamilton, another of the founding fathers of the American Republic. Relations between Burr and Hamilton deteriorated to the point that they decided to fight a duel. Burr shot Hamilton and killed him. Pistols at dawn. The election of 2000 hasn't come down to that yet, but every other manner of conflict resolution is underway, and another constitutional crisis appears on the horizon. It seems like many Democrats and Republicans regard this as round two of the Clinton impeachment battle, where obscure constitutional provisions are wielded like knives in a vicious and highly partisan street battle. The national interest seems to get lost in the melee.
Well, there was always that question, is he really one of us?
David Marinas of The Washington Post is author of First in His Class about Bill Clinton and The Prince of Tennessee about Al Gore. He says Gore learned some clear lessons from the impeachment battle that are guiding him now.
The last time I interviewed Gore, I asked him, what did you most learn from Bill Clinton? And he said, perseverance. And he's, that's what he's trying to do here, to overcome any sort of public relations that might go against him by just hanging in there, hanging tough and thinking things will break his way. But he doesn't have Clinton's luck, so I'm not sure it will happen.
Republican lawyer Barbara Olson also sees the lessons of the Clinton impeachment being applied by the Democrats during this confrontation.
Well, it's interesting, and I think there is a relationship. I think that Vice President Gore wouldn't be continuing this legal battle if there hadn't been a very significant lesson learned in impeachment. And the lesson learned is if you keep at it, you do your press briefings, which they're doing now sort of on a hourly basis, and you don't give up, at some point you just might win. You might outstay the others. You know, we kept hearing in impeachment about the rule of law and how important it was. It didn't triumph in impeachment. Now we're hearing once again that we should ignore the laws of the state court. It's the will of the people.
Democratic lawyer Lanny Davis served as special counsel to President Bill Clinton and is amused by the Republican calls for Democrats to give up already, just as they did during the impeachment process.
They're only saying give up already because they don't want the votes to be counted. If they weren't concerned about the outcome, they wouldn't really be making this argument. They're using the words recount, but there has never been any count of at least 10,000 ballots in Dade County, which is the location of Miami, because those ballots were rejected.
The negotiation will take as long as it takes to get a good deal. It's going to take as long as it takes to get a good deal, and it's going to take as long as it takes to get a good deal.
Okay, so a bit of an edit there. Clearly, though, the message today from Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, on NAFTA is that a good deal cannot be rushed. But her meeting with her U.S. and Mexican counterparts in Washington today was brief, and maybe a little too brief. As Katie Simpson explains, when it comes to NAFTA, time is ticking.
Mr. President, thanks for having us.
Donald Trump invited CEOs from the auto sector to the White House to deliver a blunt update on NAFTA negotiations.
I've never been a NAFTA fan, as you know. NAFTA's been a terrible deal for the United States, one of the worst trade deals in history.
The president's tone made it no surprise that negotiators were unable to reach a breakthrough after 5 straight days of high-level talks.
Ministers will be returning to their own countries, as we did a couple of weeks ago, to consult on the progress.
CBC News has learned the U.S. and Mexico are still arguing about changes to the auto sector. The Americans are demanding Mexico increase wage and labor standards, a move that would dramatically alter the Mexican economy.
We believe that is a way to solve autos, and I think that we are trying to make a very good effort. But we are still not in the final definition.
The decision makers are walking away for now. It's a setback, considering there had been hope an agreement was possible by today.
And Katie joins me now from Washington. So, Katie, what does this all mean with regards to the timeline for these negotiations? When will they wrap up?
Well, there's a hard deadline of May 17th that's in play right now. U.S. lawmakers say they need to have an agreement in hand by next Thursday if they're going to have enough time to approve a deal before the end of the year. Sources aren't ruling anything out, but meeting that target is very unlikely. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister had been prepared to revamp her schedule to return to Washington as early as Monday if today's meeting went well. Instead, she and her counterparts will stay in touch by phone and possibly reconvene in a couple of weeks. This means at the end of the day, the uncertainty and the drama will drag on potentially well into 2019. Andrew.
Goody. Katie Simpson, thanks so much. Now, the NAFTA deal is just one of many things adapting to a Trump presidency. So, too, apparently, are some books on the nightstand. In the age of Trump, Me Too, and Time's Up, the romance novel is changing. And the CBC's Salima Shivji takes us in for an intimate look.
However much his wife loathed him, his sisters-in-law loathed him far more.
Back in November 2016, Sarah McLean was in the middle of writing her best-selling romance novel when this...
Donald Trump wins the presidency.
Made her pause and completely rethink her leading man.
When I opened the document on the next day, I realized that I had 275 pages of a character who probably would have voted for Donald Trump, and I couldn't do it. So I threw it all out and started over.
And I moved on her.
Statements like these.
Grab him by the...
This was locker room talk.
Such a nasty woman. Trust fund.
Made the drastic edit necessary for her. She chose to shift away from the more traditional romantic arc of a jerk who takes many pages to evolve to one who's already there.
I wanted him to be that alpha feminist from the very start. I wanted him to believe in his heroine. I wanted him to believe in hope.
So the heroine kind of hates a small town.
Across the border, Toronto-based romance writer Laura Davis also found the Trump effect seeping into her writing.
Her fingers itched to unbutton his shirt and touch his chest, but she behaved herself.
Not only did she switch from erotic romance to a more comedic style, as an escape from dark headlines, she also made herself a promise to introduce more diverse characters into the world of romance.
With Donald Trump, overt racism seems to be a lot more acceptable now. And we see the news about white supremacists marching and stuff like that. So I particularly wanted to write and tell stories about heroes and heroines who aren't white, and show that they deserve to have happy endings too.
The changes are noticeable as the genre comes into its own, gaining more attention. 50 Shades of Grey, the book, exploded more than 5 years ago and vaulted romance into the mainstream.
My tastes are very singular.
The franchise has even inspired an upcoming comedy about a book club discovering the joys of reading those steamy scenes.
Whoa, what's that? That's not mine. I've never seen that book before, honestly. This is nasty.
That old hidden shame is all too common, romance as a guilty pleasure. But the much maligned black sheep of the literary world is just so popular. A billion-dollar industry making up a third of America's fiction market and packing conventions around the world. So popular that some now say its bad reputation is on its way out. The mighty New York Times Book Review has, for the first time ever, hired a romance novel reviewer, Jamie Green.
Part of the shift is that women are just sick of being made to feel embarrassed about what they love and what they enjoy reading. You know, just like overall in culture, I think there's a sort of resistance now to the idea of guilty pleasures, that if something is a pleasure, you don't need to be guilty about it.
Another shift, raunchy sex scenes are the new norm. The publisher synonymous with old-school romance, Harlequin, recently launched its Dare series, full of bold women asking for what they want in the bedroom. Still, romantic conventions abound and can be problematic in today's climate. The boss seducing his secretary, the billionaire boss walking around naked in front of an employee. Sarah McLean says altering the traditional tropes is not always easy when you're messing with a reader's fantasy.
I've had lovely hate mail about books being returned to bookstores and whole collections of my books being donated to the library.
At the end of the day, romance novels are about escape, and the all-important ending is non-negotiable.
Because everyone deserves a romantic getaway.
Happily ever after, even when politics may get you down. Salima Shivji, CBC News, Toronto.
Okay, still ahead, Winnipeg is a city in celebration as the Jets get ready to head to the Western Conference Final. And dedicated fans are certainly sharing the moment with loved ones.
People were coming up and kissing it and like the urn and holding it and wanting pictures with me with the urn.
Do you break out into a cold sweat every time you have to calculate the tip? If doing math in real life makes you anxious, you're not alone. Math anxiety is a real thing, and here's what it's actually doing to your brain. Experts say that math anxiety is the urge to avoid numbers. It's seen in children as young as 6, and it plagues more girls than boys. But it's not just an aversion to numbers. It turns out that math anxiety could actually hijack your brain.
I'm Erin Maloney, and I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa. I study cognitive and emotional factors that can relate to achievement in mathematics. Researchers have used what's called fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. What we can see is that for people who are really anxious about math, they have activation both in the areas of the brain that are sort of responsible for mathematical processing, but also areas of the brain that are responsible for fear responses. So in some ways, for these individuals who are really anxious about math, their neural activation patterns look similar to someone who would, say, have a spider phobia, or really an intense fear in a situation.
So it's like your brain trying to solve two problems at the same time, anxiety and geometry. And that extra toll on the brain can cause a lot of students to underperform in math class. But the problem just doesn't exist with students. Research shows there are high levels of math anxiety with elementary school teachers and parents too, and that could rub up on the students, especially when they're trying to teach them about math or when parents are helping their kids with homework. So how do we solve this problem? Well, experts say that we need to stop with the stereotypes about math.
Often, people who are really anxious about math will endorse stereotypes about math. So for example, they'll endorse the stereotype that some people just aren't math people. And I think that's simply just not true. So while math might come a little bit more easily to some people, what we know is that if you work hard and with the right instruction and the right mindset, really pretty much everyone can learn math. So in terms of actually strategies that we can use to address the anxiety, we've seen things like focused breathing, so mindfulness type activities that really help the students sort of decrease their anxiety before the test.
So the next time the waiter hands you a bill and you don't know how much to tip, don't fret.
The Winnipeg Jets are going to the Western Conference Final.
Well, the Jets certainly came through when it counted last night. Their reward will be an encounter with the team from Sin City. The next round against the Vegas Golden Knights opens in Winnipeg tomorrow. As Karen Pauls tells us, if fan loyalty is anything to go by, the Jets may have the edge.
As soon as that final buzzer went on Game 7, Winnipeg Jets fans congregated where they always do for big moments at the iconic intersection of Portage and Main. Among those in the crowd, Jeremy Regan. He went with a friend and his mother's ashes. It had his downtown barbershop buzzing.
I was overcome with emotion.
Regan's mom, Linda, died of cancer almost 2 years ago. She loved hockey and the Jets. Regan knew he had to share last night's party with her.
People were coming up and kissing it and like the urn and holding it and wanting pictures with me with the urn.
This is the first time an NHL team from Winnipeg has made it to the third round of playoffs. Their opponents, the Vegas Golden Knights, didn't even exist last season. But now they're the most successful North American pro sports expansion team in history.
Do you know what the prices are?
Trevor Alexander is a blogger and university radio host. He was at the arena this morning to check on ticket sales.
We hope that we can certainly make the country proud and maybe eliminate Vegas and compete for that cup again.
Jets captain Blake Wheeler says they're expecting a tough matchup.
Coming into the playoffs, I mean, that team had quite a bit more playoff experience than our team.
Forward Mark Scheifele knows what's at stake. It's been 25 years since a Canadian team won the Stanley Cup.
Feels good to be a Canadian team, going this far.
Was she a big Jets fan?
Yeah, she got me into hockey.
Back at the barber shop, Jeremy Regan says the Jets are doing more than just playing hockey.
It just brings us together on a human kind of level, right?
And if the Jets go all the way,
Mama's coming back to Portage and Main.
Karen Pauls, CBC News, Winnipeg.
Well, it was a year ago this week that Donald Trump fired James Comey. And it's now, all this time later, the former FBI director is sharing his side of the story in his book, A Higher Loyalty. That's what recently brought him to Toronto, where he sat down to talk with CBC Radio's Pia Chattopadhyay. And that is our moment of the day.
When that email case was opened, my deputy director looked at me and said, with a wry smile, "You know you're totally screwed, right?" It was a nightmare for me. It still is. But I honestly can't say that I would do it differently if I had to go back. Truth is the central value in the FBI, and I hope in my country and this great country that it matters. We are all becoming numb to the melting of that central value, of that truth. We are all overwhelmed with falsehoods. When I see the leader of the country constantly attacking that rule of law, I worry for the future. Donald Trump will pass from the scene in the United States. The question is, what have we learned from this time? What I'm trying to be part of is making sure we have a conversation today so that we emerge from this period, which I liken to a forest fire. There'll be lots of growth and all kinds of cool things, but so that we minimize the damage and accelerate the healing coming out of this.
So I will say this, I've seen a few Comey interviews now, some of them quite serious, others quite silly, like the ones he's done on late night TV. And it's been quite striking to see very different sides of James Comey, none of which are similar at all to the side of him we saw while he was FBI director. But I suppose the difference now is that he has a book to talk about. That is The National for this Friday, May 11th. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great night.